Welcome to What I Watch Wednesdays, where I talk about different movies and TV shows that I've watched and my thoughts on them. Today we're going to be talking about Widow's Bay, a comedy horror Apple TV series. The series follows Mayor Tom Loftus as he tries to revamp the cursed island he's the mayor of into a tourist attraction. The town carries a really cursed reputation, and all of the locals are against having people come visit their town. There's a really long history of weird events and unexplained phenomena that's going on in the town that the mayor tries to cover up. The show builds this really brilliant balance between the horror aspects of the show and the comedic aspects of the show, oftentimes leveraging the horror aspects to be the comedic elements. Let's talk a little bit about what makes the island cursed. From the very first episode, we see the town being affected by whatever is happening when a fisherman goes out to sea and comes back completely paranoid and scary. The show refuses to give any clear-cut answers. Every time it answers something, that leads to more questions. On paper, the show should be horrifying. There's a lot of creepy stuff going on. The show balances this with the comedy aspects incredibly well. What really does it is the fact that the residents treat the horror as day-to-day and are completely apathetic about it. The comedy comes from the fact that the horror is ridiculous and the writers are fully aware of that. They're leaning into it instead of trying to make it a super serious show. At no point are you suffering from a suspension of disbelief because the show treats the horror as a joke instead of using jokes to break up the tension. Instead of normal comedy horror shows, making it so that every time something weird happens, there's a joke to cut the tension. That was my main problem with Obsession. Every single time there was something weird that happened, there's a quick joke that happens that breaks the tension. Instead of Widow's Bay relying on cheap jokes to break the tension, they make the horror part of the joke itself. A lot of the humor comes from the fact that Tom is trying to cover up all of these weird shenanigans happening because he's trying to make this place into a tourist attraction. I think of it like the IT Crowd meets What We Do in the Shadows, where What We Do in the Shadows is like a horror comedy. IT Crowd is about workplace comedy. There's a lot of workplace / PR comedy that happens alongside the horror aspects of it, and the writers did such a wonderful job of balancing these two aspects. Every single time there's something weird that happens, we see Tom not worried about whatever just happened, but more worried about what it'll look like to potential visitors of the island. It's really funny seeing him freak out about a cursed inn or some weird lady attacking people and not being worried about the fact that there's like cursed things going on, but being worried about how people who might visit the island will interpret the weird stuff that's going on. The townspeople also help to feed into this. They've been living with this weird curse for so long that they no longer care about the stuff that's happening. You see some really horrifying stuff going on, and then the townspeople are like, oh yeah, that just happens. Let's talk a little bit about all of the episodes. We begin with episode 1 called Welcome to Widow's Bay. Tom is trying to make this cursed island into a tourist trap. What triggers this is when a journalist visits the island, and that causes Tom to start pitching it as a hidden gem ripe for investment. There's a weird incident that happens with a local fisherman who is normal at first and then goes off into sea to go fishing. When he comes back, he's very affected by whatever happened to him out on sea, and he attacks Tom. Unfortunately, he passes away when he's taken to the hospital, and there's no explanation for this. After the attack, Tom starts seeing the town changing. There's this local guy named Wick who says that there's something ancient about the town that is waking up. The episode ends with a cliffhanger with Tom discovering a deep underground bunker that literally opens up to a door that leads even more underground. Episode 2 is called Lodging. Following the positive media coverage that somehow happened after the events of episode 1, the town is inundated with a bunch of different tourists. We see the locals trying to adjust to all of these newcomers to the town while also dealing with the cursed aspects of the town and trying to hide it. The reverend of the church begins to dig into the town's history after the bell starts ringing by itself 9 times. Tom agrees to spend a night in the Breakwater Inn, which is like a cursed location. During his stay, he meets this guy named William, but the encounter becomes really weird, and it ends with a dreamlike state where it feels very threatening and disturbing. We cut to them later seeing security footage of Tom literally just talking to air. Other residents also start to get affected by time, as well as memory gaps when they enter certain rooms in the inn. Despite all of these weird happenings, Tom refuses to shut the town down. Episode 3 is called The Inaugural Swim. At the beginning of the episode, Tom meets this lady who's visiting who seems normal. Her name is Marissa, and everything seems fairly okay at first. However, very quickly, the local legend of an old sea hag crops up, and the figure actually appears and scratches Tom. This causes paranoia to set in, and Tom begins to suspect that Marissa is a sea hag. Because Tom was scratched by the sea hag, this marks him as a potential victim. He later encounters encounters the sea hag in his home, but Wick arrives just in time to help stop the situation. Meanwhile, Tom's son, Evan, is talking to a bunch of teens who are visiting the town on vacation. There's this really funny dichotomy of Evan describing all of the weird stuff that he has encountered while growing up, and all of the people who he's talking to being kind of horrified by all of the weird stuff. Evan's completely unfazed by this. He acts like nothing weird is going on and that everything he's talking about is completely normal. That is part of what makes the show so funny. Beyond just seeing the horror aspects and the way that Tom tries to deal with that, it's just the complete apathy of the local townspeople being completely unfazed. Episode 4 is called Beach Reads, and we get introduced to this character who's a social outcast in the town because of her past with the boogeyman. Nobody believes that she encountered the boogeyman. Patricia is dealing with a lot of trauma as a result of nobody believing her. She comes across a self-help book and decides to throw a massive event for the townspeople. During her event, a lot of the guests start drinking this cocktail that ends up putting them in a trance-like state and walk into the ocean. Patricia manages to break everybody out of the trance that they get into by literally destroying the book that she used in order to throw her party. This causes a momentary bit of tension to be lifted. However, unfortunately, the Reverend that I mentioned in episode 2 is later found dead. Episode 5 is called What to Expect on Your Trip. The episode follows immediately after the Reverend's discovered. Tom passes a curfew on the town in order to maintain some semblance of control. The townspeople investigate into the Reverend's belongings. They discover a couple of mushrooms, a few journals, as well as a phone number for some man named Todd O'Connor. They call Todd and he explains that the mushrooms trigger an effect that lets you see into the island's consciousness. Tom accidentally ingests these and is taken back to memories of his wife named Lauren, as well as traumatic experiences with his son's birth. Episode 6, which is called Our History. Episode 6 is all about the past of the island, and we're immediately transported back to the 1700s. We're introduced to this character named Sarah Westcott, who's on a journey to come and marry the town's founder. She arrives on Widow's Bay, but finds that everybody has been plagued by illness, paranoia, and sudden disappearances. She originally comes to the island in order to marry the guy who created the town. His name is Richard Warren. Sarah very quickly discovers that Richard is a tyrant. She also discovers a network of tunnels that are underneath their home. This ties back to the tunnels that Tom discovers in episode 1. A little bit of drama ensues, and there's this rebel group that tries to overthrow Warren. They manage to bury him alive. Warren talks about a blood pact that he made with an entity via the mushrooms that I was talking about from episode 5. The pact that he made requires continuous human sacrifice in order to keep the island stable. In the present, we see Wick digging up Warren's grave. I really enjoyed this episode because it gave us a little bit of a hint as to the lore behind what is happening. It also had a lot of really good scenic moments throughout the episode. The entire history, them trying to overthrow the weird tyrant guy, them burying him alive, all of it was done in a really well filmed way. Following the lore drop in episode 6 and Wick digging up Richard's grave, Richard Warren is still a living entity that's tied to the island's consciousness himself. He explains to Tom and Wick about the original pact that he made with the spirits on the island, and he agrees to help them, but only if they help him move on for real. They agree to help him by taking him into the water away from the boundary of the island. During the journey, Richard begins to act kind of weird and psychotic. They manage to subdue him though, and the minute we get past the island's threshold, he disappears. This gives us a little bit of hope that the cursed happenings on the island is isolated to only the island. Episode 8 follows this seeming victory. Following this, Tom begins to move. He immediately starts packing his bags. He's just done at this point. However, Tom's plans shatter when Evan confronts him about his mother. This causes the episode to shift from the weird external drama happening of the island and the curseness to the present day weird family drama that Tom is facing. Patricia also faces her demons head on during a physical battle with the boogeyman, and we see that she ultimately defeats him. Wick tells Tom they shouldn't be lulled into a false sense of security and the island is still out to get them. Episode 9 is called Emergency Shelter. During this episode, a violent storm rolls into town and it cuts off all communication with the mainland. This forces the townspeople to go into emergency shelters. Richard Warren dying does not cause the curse itself to die out. The pact that he made isn't tied to a singular person or entity. It's actually tied to the family lineage instead. That means that the curse was inherited through all of the descendants. Wick discovers that there's a direct descendant of Richard who is still alive. This makes them believe that that woman is the person who is causing the curse to still be alive. The storm, meanwhile, continues to rage on. The show paints it as though it's a response to Wick and Tom try to get rid of the curse. The final episode of the first season is called We Hope You've Enjoyed Your Time. Ruth, the woman I mentioned in episode 9, is not the actual heir. It's actually Evan. Tom covers this up because the townspeople are on the hunt in order to break the curse. While inside the shelter, we make a very chilling discovery that the townspeople have not just been living with the curse for centuries, but they've actively been helping it along by making sacrifices to keep it going. It explains so much about the townspeople general attitude and the weird apathy that a lot of the people have towards the curse. Evan and a couple other local kids go into the tunnel and they find the primary sacrificial chamber. This leads to another sacrifice happening, which marks the end of the storm. The next morning, everything looks serene. Everybody assumes that the curse was broken. However, the church's bell once again rings, but instead of 9 times, it rings 8 times this time. Across the 10 episodes, we see a very tight narrative structure where bits of the mystery are treated as something that helps to move the story along rather than something that is solved. Every single answer that we get doesn't really answer anything, it just leads to more questions. So let's talk about a little bit of what worked in Widow's Bay Season 1. I want to highlight the fact that the tone clashes that we see throughout the season work so well because the characters are allowed to be funny while also being flawed and petty. They feel very real instead of being idealized. The way that the characters treat all of the goings on with utter nonchalance, the dichotomy of that with the tourists who are experiencing all of this and freaking out is really funny. It's almost like the island itself is a character. We see the island actively working against the protagonists. Nothing about the island is ordinary. Also, the way that the writers integrated the lore drop from a fairly late point in the series and made it seamlessly integrate with everything that we've seen so far is done ridiculously well. It just adds on to what happened in the earlier episodes. I have seen too many TV shows where they have a random piece of lore that drops very late in the show and it makes the earlier episodes kind of defunct. It's very clear that the writers designed the entire show around the lore drop instead of writing the earlier episodes and then fitting in the lore drop. I liken this a lot to Only Murders in the Building, season 1 specifically. I love that show, and you can tell in season 1 that even though they didn't know exactly who would be whodunit figure, they had a couple of different interpretations for who it could be, and every episode draws back to that. You can tell that they had the idea of this blood pact and all of the weird stuff from the very beginning, and every single episode is leading up to that. Everything about the set design is done so well. The weird, creepy looking tunnels, the church, all of that stuff was done in a way that adds to the tension and helps to set the scene, literally, of what is going on in this island. They really managed to build on all of the corruptness and the rottedness underneath the island's surface. The last thing that I want to highlight about what was so well done about this series is that the episode titles themselves are quite literally what brochures would say about the island if you were visiting it. All of the episodes are describing different aspects that you might see in like a tourist brochure, and I think that is so clever, and it goes to speak about how well this series is written. Even though a series might be very, very well written, there are of course going to be a few aspects that are maybe not as well written. The first one being that a lot of the character arcs felt like plot devices. It kind of makes it feel that the character arcs don't matter. It really felt like Wick was just a plot device that we see whenever we have a creepy encounter. Same with like the introduction of Evan's mom. Even though they are characters that were built into the show, there was no real character development. This to me takes away from the emotional investments that I can make with the characters. It doesn't actually matter. A lot of these characters are just going to be introduced as vehicles to talk about what's going on. Also, I feel like the writers didn't fully lean in on any of the discoveries. Every single time they revealed a piece of lore or something, they very quickly rushed to explain it away, even though there aren't too many explanations about the greater show's mythology. Every time we see a lore drop, immediately afterwards in the next episode, we see an explanation of that. And this might be a fault of mine because I ended up watching the show after all of the episodes dropped in one cohesive loop. So it's like, I didn't really get to sit with the episodes. That was a recurring theme that I noticed. The episodes did not let you sit with any of the information that you get exposed to. And that takes away from the creepy horror aspect, which is why I consider this more of a comedy show that has elements of horror and supernatural, but isn't a horror show. This kind of continues on with the sort of weak writing at points. I've noticed that there are a few different subplots that didn't get satisfactory endings. Really, I think the only ones that got explained was Patricia's storyline. Beyond that, we didn't really get satisfactory endings for a lot of the subplots. I feel like that was the writers kind of boxing themselves in because they had a very short window to talk about all of the different subplots that they introduced, and I think that they realized that they were in over their head. By the time episode 10 rolled around, we have gotten a lore drop that explains why the island is behaving in the way that it does, and it takes away the creepy dread that the earlier episodes had. If you've ever seen Mystery Incorporated, when we start seeing more lore, the earlier episodes really suffer. The same thing happens here. When we start seeing more lore and get an explanation for everything, the show as a whole starts to feel a lot less creepy. The writers could have definitely done something to make it so that we get an explanation for this, but it doesn't follow such a rigid set of rules, down to the point where like even the church bell thing gets repeated at the end. With all of that being said, I think that Widow's Bay operates best when the writers leave things in the shadows and don't explain every single detail about the creepy nature of what's going on. When it starts heading into the lore, it starts to suffer because the writers are suddenly locked in by arbitrary rules. It does stumble slightly in the later half of the show. Despite that, it is an incredibly tight piece of writing. My overall rating is an 8.6. If they had managed to tighten up those last few episodes just a little bit, ultimately though, it's such a tight, well-written piece of work that I'm excited for season 2, and I hope that they can continue with the quality. Season 1 was built originally as like a mini-series or anthology as far as I know, so you can totally just watch season 1 and get away with it if season 2 happens to suck. With the writing style and the writing team though, I have my doubts that season 2 will suffer. That was all of my thoughts about Widow's Bay. Let me know if you've seen this show and what your thoughts were about it. Did you also think that the writing kind of suffered in the latter half? Did you like the comedy aspects and how they balanced out the horror elements? Let me know also what other TV shows you want me to watch or movies. I love you guys so much, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!